Akhil, Amar, it is such an honor to be with you here at the 92nd Street Y to launch your new book, Born Equal, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1840 to 1920. The official launch for your book will be the day before Constitution Day, September 16th, will be at the National Constitution Center, where I'm standing right now in front of the great First Amendment tablet, gazing onto Independence Hall, the most sacred constitutional space in America. But we're so excited to have this conversation, which will be a great preparation for our talk in September. Welcome, Akhil. And why don't we just start by sharing with our audience what you're hoping to achieve in your great new book, Born Equal.
Jeff, it's so great to be with you. Our audience may not know, but you and I know, of course, that we have a history. We go way back. We're very close friends. You were my student way back when, and now the apprentice has surpassed the master. So I may be Yoda to your Skywalker or something like that. But I'm so very proud of you. And I'm so very proud of the National Constitution Center, which you run. You're the president, and you have been for many years. And it's a very special space. I helped actually launch it way back when, because it tells the story of America, about what we Americans have in common, which is most of all our shared history as a people, organized around, I think, two constitutive documents more than any others: the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And as you just mentioned, the National Constitution Center is on axis with, looks out upon Independence Hall. Is one of the best views in all of America. And in Independence Hall, both the Declaration and the Constitution were drafted. The Declaration in 1776 and the Constitution in 1787. And I was proud to help found the National Constitution Center many years ago. And the new book project is very much connected to that. I'm trying to write 3 volumes about our history, ours as an American people. Volume 1, the Fellowship of the Ring, was called The Words That Made Us. The us is a pun, the U.S., we, the people, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. That's how we came together and became a people. This is volume 2, Born Equal, Remaking America's Constitution, 1840 to 1920. And it tells the story of basically the Lincolnian idea of equality that takes a root and that eventually gets put into the Constitution in a series of amendments after the Civil War, 13, 14, 15, eventually 19. So ending slavery, promising civil rights to all, birthright, citizenship, no race discrimination, no sex discrimination in civil rights, Black voting rights, eventually equal women's voting rights. And then volume 3, if I live long enough, will take the story. It's called tentatively Earth's Best Hope, from 1920 to the present moment. So that was a long answer to a short question, but what I'm trying to do with these books is the same thing I tried to do helping to launch the National Constitution Center, create basically a resource for my fellow citizens to understand what they have in common with each other, which, to repeat, is most of all our Constitution and the history behind it, which of course includes the Declaration. And in this book, Abe Lincoln is at the center, but so is Harriet Beecher Stowe and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass. It's the equality idea that was promised by the Declaration and is now actually fulfilled in an amended Constitution.
Well, you are playing such an invaluable civic role in inspiring American citizens to recognize that what we share in common is our Constitution and our Declaration. You've also contributed to the National Constitution Center's America 250 Civic Toolkit, and you've annotated the entire Declaration of Independence clause by clause, along with Sam Desai, and have shown its historic roots. And I want everyone who's watching to check out the Civic Toolkit at constitutioncenter.org. Akhil, let's begin with the words that made us equal, as you put it so beautifully. You note that that language, all men are created equal, dates back to the Revolutionary era state constitutions, beginning with Ben Franklin's Pennsylvania Constitution and John Adams's Massachusetts Constitution. And they in turn go all the way back to John Locke. And you note that Locke talked about people being born free and equal in a state of nature. Was Locke the first of the thinkers to use the word equal? As early as John Milton, decades earlier, English thinkers had talked about people being born free and independent. But was Locke the source of the word equal? And then take us all the way up through the Revolutionary era state constitutions to the Declaration.
I'm not sure if he was the first, but he was the most prominent. He's building on certain theological concepts that humans are children of God, and we're different than beasts of the field, tameable beasts of the field. We have souls. We have relationships to the Almighty and responsibilities to and rights against each other. And the Lockean idea, in effect, is that no one is born a slave and no one is born a master. And we must refrain, actually, from treating each other as mere beasts of the field. If I'm out somewhere in the wilderness and I come across an animal, I can capture that animal, try to tame it, make it my pet. Maybe I could kill the animal for food or sport. But I can't do that if I run across a fellow human being in the wilderness. So Locke is basically saying we're equal in a certain way. We're not equally tall. You and I aren't the tallest folks around. We have different skin colors. Some are born male and female, but we're all born equal in our rights, our inalienable rights to life, to liberty, and eventually it will be said, the pursuit of happiness. Here's, my forthcoming book, Born Equal. It sits nicely alongside your forthcoming book, The Pursuit of Liberty, which is a riff on the pursuit of happiness. Now, what the introduction to the book mentions, and by the way, in the audio version, the audible version, my friend John Mulaney actually narrates that, and he's a big Lincoln fan. And Lincoln is riffing on all of this in the Gettysburg Address. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty, pursuit of liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So he's riffing on the Declaration, which is borrowing from Locke. But what I insist in the introduction is the Declaration isn't uniquely Jefferson's. As you mentioned, there's Ben Franklin alongside him. There's John Adams alongside him. That's the great Trumbull painting in the Capitol Rotunda. And this is important because if you think it's just Jefferson, then it's Virginia and it's slaveholding, and you might have one idea. But if it's Franklin, okay, that's Pennsylvania, and Franklin's very, more resolutely anti-slavery, and there's Adams from Massachusetts, and they take the same Lockean idea that they helped encode in the Declaration and put it in state constitutions, Pennsylvania in 1776, Massachusetts in 1780, and these will be the ur-texts, the prototypes of northern state constitutions that from the beginning end slavery in the North, which you won't see if you think it's just Jefferson and Virginia, because Virginia doesn't end slavery, but Pennsylvania does in a starting with a state constitution that says all persons are born free and equal, and a Massachusetts constitution, all people are born free and equal, which is going to lead to the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts. And eventually, almost all the northern states will adopt state constitutions that take this phrase, born free and equal, or some very close cousin of it, are by nature free and equal. From the French, naître, to be born. Okay, so we're born free and equal. We're by nature free and equal. And what that means is we're equal, at least this is Lincoln's interpretation, maybe not in all respects, maybe everyone doesn't get to vote equally, but we're all equal in that none of us is born a slave. None of us is born a master, and it is wrong for anyone to try to enslave another person because we are not tameable beasts of the field.
So powerful to anchor that idea of birthright equality in Lincoln and Gettysburg, but to show that it dates back to Locke, to Franklin, to Adams, and is central to the American founding. You then go on in the preface to say that this idea of birthright equality is invoked by people throughout history, including African Americans and women who are insisting that it should be extended to live up to its promise. And your first chapter about London describes the first World Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840. Tell us about why you chose that to begin the book and how it showed the clash between the misogyny of the delegates and the inclusive language that would eventually lead to the Seneca Falls Convention.
So it was kind of serendipitous. I want to write 3 volumes about American history chronologically, and the first one ended in 1840. That seemed a good place to draw the curtain down, because that's when all the founders, the last of the founders, passed away, and now it's a new generation. And book 1 was 80 years, 80 years. So the new book is going to start in 1840. That turned out to be a serendipitous place to start. The last book focuses on the Big Six. It's about America, but America produces these amazing people. And the Big Six, by acclamation, are the first 4 presidents: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, along with Hamilton and Franklin, and they're the ones that you write about very much in your books. That by acclamation, those are the most important. Now, they're all white. They're all male. Many of them are high-born. And this new volume begins in 1840, and serendipitously, a couple of things happen there. And its heroes and heroines are going to be actually demographically different. And that's interesting that this new cast of characters, Abe Lincoln, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, most of all, 2 white women, a black man, a white man, many of them low-born. Frederick Douglass is born a slave. He doesn't even know his own birthday. He doesn't know ever. He doesn't know for sure who his father is. Abe Lincoln is born into the dirt, and he doesn't have a great relationship with his barely literate father. But 1840 turned out to be a great date to start for 2 reasons. Not just, the founders have just died off, but the new generation. 1, James Madison dies, and his notes about the Philadelphia Convention become public, actually, and that's chapter 2. But now Americans know in much more detail what happened behind closed doors in Philadelphia. The ban of secrecy lapsed, actually, when the Philadelphia Convention ended, but you still didn't have a day-by-day, blow-by-blow kind of journalistic account until 1840, Madison. That's chapter 2. Oh, but chapter 1, it's even more fun. The world's first anti-slavery convention convenes. It's in London. These the most philanthropic, reform-minded, egalitarian people in the world. They're meeting to end, if they can, the world's greatest problem, which back then, it's not climate change yet, it's worldwide slavery. And the project of ending slavery actually has begun, Jeff, right where you are, in Philadelphia in 1775. The ancient world had slavery. It doesn't begin in 1619. There was slavery in Africa and Asia, and most parts of the world. Many Native Americans had slavery amongst themselves. So there was slavery. before 1619 in the world. And there was the idea of freeing slaves. Ben-Hur, funny thing happened on the way to the forum. Okay, but the idea of ending slavery, not freeing individual slaves, ending slavery, that was born in Philadelphia in 1775 with the world's first anti-slavery organization, and it's in Philadelphia. Ben Franklin will eventually become president. Benjamin Rush, these guys signed the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so Americans actually invent not slavery, but the idea of abolition. And they do that in the American Revolution. But now the world is catching up and America is lagging behind because the Brits end slavery in the British Empire, or most of it, not in India, but for most of the empire in 1833. So now the Brits are surging ahead. The North has gotten rid of slavery, but not the Deep South. And they say, let's hold a world convention to do something. And they do. And chapter 1 tells the story of this young bride from upstate New York. Her name is Elizabeth Cady. She has just gotten married on a lark. I mean, but without a lot of preparation. And she goes with her husband, who's an abolitionist. And they sail off to London to end slavery. And the first thing that the delegates do on day one, they're largely Brit, is kick the women out. Elizabeth herself wasn't a delegate, but 8 were, and most of them were from Philadelphia. Lucretia Mott, a Quaker abolitionist, and she had been elected as a delegate, and so had 7 other American women. And the first thing that happens on day one is the men kick the women out. I thought that was an interesting story about racial equality and slavery and women's equality. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's 25 years old, she's on her honeymoon, says, darn it. She goes up to Lucretia Mott. She says, when we get back home, meaning America, we're going to have our own darn convention. And that's going to become Seneca Falls, which is all about women's rights, and when you read the Seneca Falls Declaration, this is chapter 3, it's word for word the Declaration of Independence. It's rhyming with the Declaration. It's a declaration of sentiments, as in a Declaration of Independence. And they rewrite it. They say, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And they take all the grievances of the Declaration of Independence that are going to be annotated at the National Constitution Center interactive declaration site. They take all those grievances and they modify them a little bit. They riff on them and show how women have been mistreated. The Declaration is of Independence thundering against King George. He's done this. He's done this. He's done this. He. And Elizabeth and Lucretia and others, and Frederick Douglass is going to be there too, actually say, man has done this to woman. He's done this, he's done this, he's done this. And they end up actually calling for women's suffrage. And that, so I begin with Elizabeth Cady Stanton going to the world's first anti-slavery convention, and the men kick out the women. And it's going to end, and it's going to travel through Seneca Falls and the Civil War and Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and all the rest. And it's going to end in 1920 in Philadelphia with the last living woman from Seneca Falls. She was 17 years old at Seneca Falls. Now she's in her 90s. She lives in Philadelphia, and she looks out and sees, because of the 19th Amendment, women across the country voting equally, just as Elizabeth wanted. But Elizabeth becomes radicalized in chapter 1 on her honeymoon when the men, the philanthropic, egalitarian, reform-minded men kick the women out.
Akhil, it's so exciting to hear you tell these stories. You talk about history zigzagging and say that it's not linear, but you really have to show the interwoven threads and go back to Madison's notes in 1840 to understand their impact on Frederick Douglass and on the abolitionists and on John Quincy Adams. And you trace the argument that there's a vast congressional power over slavery during wartime to Quincy Adams and talk about his transformative effect in chapter 4. So going back to the publication of Madison's notes in 1840, tell us what light they helped shed on the convention's treatment of slavery and how they influenced both the Seneca Falls abolitionist, and then just tell the story about the central constitutional influence of the great John Quincy Adams.
So note, audience members, that You thought the Declaration was all about Jefferson. It wasn't. He was just part of a team. And therefore, you thought it was all about Virginia. And Virginia is not unimportant. And, 8 of the first 9 presidential elections are won by a Virginian. But I'm going to try to, in the end, tell you how we get rid of slavery and promote equality. And it's going to be more of a Pennsylvania and a Massachusetts and a New York story. It's going to be more of a Yankee story in some ways. And who's more Yankee than John Quincy Adams and Elizabeth Cady Stanton from upstate New York? So this is about geography. And it's also about the intergenerational saga. It's a little bit like Roots. It's an intergenerational story, or Wuthering Heights for that matter. It's an intergenerational story. So Jeff, you you grew up in New York City, and that's kind of like Hamilton's place or something. But I've been to your family estate in upstate New York. That's where Elizabeth is from. Upstate New York is a huge hotbed of radicalism. And so is Philadelphia, where you are now, the National Constitution Center, which I helped launch. It's a hotbed, and the Quakers, and they're very reform-minded. Oh, and so is Boston, and that's John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams, and you wrote a paper way back when for me on Theophilus Parsons, from Boston. So it's about Boston, it's about Philadelphia, it's about upstate New York. John Quincy Adams is this fascinating character. He's the missing link in my story. He's the only president who rubbed shoulders with both George Washington and Abe Lincoln. And when he dies, when he collapses on the floor of the House of Representatives, Lincoln is about 10 paces away. And Lincoln is actually on the funeral committee, making arrangements for JQA's funeral. And of course, not of course, people don't know this, his funeral train, taking his body back from the Capitol to Quincy, Braintree, Massachusetts, is going to foreshadow Lincoln's funeral train, taking his body later on back to Springfield. So JQA is a chip off the old block, and he's a chip off the Declaration block, because John Adams thinks he's been cheated, basically, that Jefferson stole all the credit, whereas he was, for the Declaration, and he was there too, and he never quite gets over it. John Adams is an amazing character. He looms very large in Volume 1. Now his son comes on the scene, and his son wants to claim the Declaration for the Adamses, for himself, for Massachusetts. And so, for example, I talk in that a chapter about the gag rule. And John Quincy Adams becomes old man eloquent against the gag rule. But what is he championing? The idea of petitioning. And the right of petition includes a right to actually have the petition received and at least read aloud. Now, it doesn't say any of that. So where's he getting that idea from? Because actually, the grievances of the founders were that King George wouldn't allow American petitions to even be read to him. And so he's saying, like, the Southerners are actually more tyrannical than King George III. He didn't allow petitions to be read to him. They're trying to prevent petitions from being introduced in Congress. He's beginning to claim his family heritage, and he doesn't begin that way. And as a young politician, he has to suck up to the South, because he wants to be president. His vice president is actually John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. But once he's out of office, he doesn't need to suck up to the South anymore. The 3/5 clause gives a big leg up to Southerners. But once he's no longer president, he becomes old man eloquent, championing increasingly an anti-slavery crusade, which is very popular in Massachusetts. And that is a story that I tell sort of in chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 1, as we talked about, was all about Elizabeth Cady Stanton in London. Chapter 2 is about Madison's notes in Philadelphia, zigzagging all the way back to the founding. 3 is about Seneca Falls. 4 and 5, John Quincy Adams looking backward. This is zigzagging to his father and the Declaration of Independence, but foreshadowing Lincoln's memes and themes. And indeed, as soon as John Quincy Adams collapses, a third generation of Adams will move up, and that's Charles Francis Adams, his son, who in upstate New York, Buffalo, is actually going to champion a free soil crusade, a new party that's going to eventually become the Republican Party. And what's its big meme? Its big meme is no slavery in the West. Free speech, free press, free soil, free labor, free men. And eventually it'll become in 1856. Oh, and Fremont, John C. Fremont. And that's going to be Lincoln's party. So JQA in my narration is the missing link in this, roots-like narrative. I had Kunta Kinte, and I had Alex Haley. I had to find, who the links were in between.
Amazing. And the fact that Lincoln was there when JQA died and witnessed it and then carried on that sacred mantle is extraordinary. Take us now up from John Quincy Adams' death to 1848 and the central message presented to American voters then, as it was encapsulated in the Free Soil Party. You note that Americans repeatedly chose presidents who consciously invoked the Declaration and the Constitution. How did Charles Francis Adams and Lincoln see America as an experiment that might fail if we didn't kindle to the principles of the Declaration? And how did that lead to Lincoln's great Peoria speech?
So we Americans don't have that much in common, truthfully. We have different skin colors and religious creeds and national origins, even first language. It's a vast country, north, south, east to west. What we have in common is the Constitution and the Declaration. Now, what's the relationship between those? But Lincoln grasped this better than anyone. And even as a young man, he's talking about this in the Lyceum Address. He says, we have to be faithful to our fathers. And he comes up with a compelling interpretation of what our fathers really did. Yes, they had slavery. And in fact, they didn't get rid of it, but they dedicated themselves to a proposition that all men are created equal, says Lincoln. And he says, you didn't need that in order to achieve independence from Britain. All you have to say is these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Done. And that was actually July 2nd. Okay. Why did you have this long list? Lincoln says, because we are a country of principle. We are a creedal country. We believe certain things. What's at the center of our creed? Lincoln says, building on Charles Francis Adams, building on John Quincy Adams, building on John Adams in certain ways. At the center of our creed is that all men are created equal. African Americans are claiming that sentence. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is claiming that sentence. Frederick Douglass is claiming that sentence. And Lincoln will try to make that the cornerstone of the new foundation, the keystone of the arch. Is Pennsylvania the keystone state? I think it's the Quaker state, I know, but anyway. So Lincoln and many of the most successful early politicians, early presidents especially, they claim the Constitution, the Declaration. They don't spit on it. Isn't it interesting, you see, that, okay, John Quincy Adams, he's the son of a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Oh, and so is William Henry Harrison. Like, what are the odds that, there are not that many people who signed the Declaration, but that their children will be the most successful politicians? Who is JQA's running mate? It's actually Richard Rush, whose father was Benjamin Rush. So early Americans are ridiculously proud of their origins. They're originalists of a certain way. And the greatest originalist is Lincoln. He claims the Constitution, he claims the Declaration, but he has a certain interpretation of it. And it's a Northern interpretation. It's not a Southern interpretation, which is why if you're trying to figure out who actually won and you sort of trace it back, it's less Virginia, it's less Jefferson, it's more Franklin and Adams and John Quincy Adams and Charles Francis Adams and the Free Soil Party. And as America expands, the Mexican-American War, we get a lot of new territory. This is the existential question is whether this new territory is going to be free soil or slave soil. Because if it's going to be slave soil, America will tilt towards slavery. If it's going to be free soil, then we're putting slavery on a path of ultimate extinction. It's like containing communism. You have to stop it from spreading, and then we can shrink it down, like chemotherapy. Stop the tumor from spreading, and then shrink it down. We have to actually, say, read our lips, no new slavery, free soil for the West. That's going to be Lincoln's theme, but he's going to stand on the shoulders of Charles Francis Adams, who is riffing on his father and grandfather.
Wow. Tell us about the evolution of Lincoln's constitutional vision, and in particular about the relationship between three of his great speeches. He stands in front of Independence Hall in 1861 and says, "I'd rather be assassinated on the spot than abandon the principles of Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence." And then he sums up the relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution in a beautiful phrase. He says, both are based on the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry to all. What was the significance of Lincoln's joining of the ideas of liberty, equality, and that phrase, liberty to all? And then how does that connect to the Gettysburg Address?
So I've held up my new book, Born Equal, and here's your new book, Pursuit of Liberty, and they connect. That's the word liberty. So he thinks you're born free. That's a Germanized version of the Latinate liberty. You're born free and equal. You're born with liberty. We're not born equal in all respects. Not everyone, for example, in Lincoln's view, gets to vote. We're not going to have women are born free and equal in their rights to not be enslaved, their liberty, but they're not going to become equal voters until the end of my book, 1920. So Lincoln's idea is there's a certain kind of equality. It's an equality of liberty, of freedom of thought, freedom of conscience. And Jeff, you wrote way back when your major student piece of writing, it's about, excuse me, freedom of conscience and freedom of thought and freedom of expression. And of course, bodily freedom, you can't be, enslaved by someone else. If someone else owns you, they can rape you, they can whip you, they can sell you. And then you would have liberty. Liberty of body, freedom of thought, freedom of mind. That's Lincoln's early vision. He's not yet ready to say when he's running against Stephen Douglas for the Senate and the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he's not ready quite to say blacks should be equal voters or even blacks should be equal citizens. He just said they're equally free. They have a right to earn to earn from the sweat of their brow, what they produce. He thinks it's wrong to say, you work and toil and earn bread and I'll eat it. Everyone has a right, basically, a Lockean kind of right to the fruit of their own labor and to their mind and their soul. And that's like, he's going to grow. He's going to become more expansive. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, folks, are a great debate about the meaning of the Declaration of Independence. They're a great, originalist debate. And Douglas says, actually, blacks just don't count. They're not men. They're not humans. And Lincoln says, well, of course they're humans. No one thought that they weren't humans until you came along, Stephen Douglas. And within 5 years, your whole party, their new mantra, their new meme is, oh, it wasn't about blacks. And Lincoln's saying, you just made all that up. Okay, but Douglas says, well, if it was about blacks, how do you explain that they had slavery and didn't get rid of it? And here's Lincoln's compelling argument. Yes, they had slavery, but they knew it was wrong. And they committed themselves to certain principles. They wanted God on their side to win the Revolutionary War. And God wouldn't be on their side unless they actually at least condemned slavery in principle. And so Lincoln's interpretation is, yes, they had it, but they thought it was wrong. They didn't use the word in the Constitution. They were ashamed of it. And they meant, he's making originalist arguments. to put slavery on a path of ultimate extinction. And the most compelling originalist case that he makes for that is at Cooper Union, when he's kind of running for president. And wow, it looks like Scalia. It looks like Bork. You see, originalist, friends, isn't just, a monopoly of conservatives. The greatest originalist of all time is Abe Lincoln. And read Cooper Union. You could do it in half an hour, audience members. And he goes through founder by founder by founder, and he says, even if they had slaves, they believed in limiting or prohibiting slavery in the West and putting us on a path of ultimate extinction. So Lincoln arises in the aftermath of the Free Soil movement, and he creates a compelling constitutional vision, first in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and then when he runs for president at Cooper Union, and then when he becomes president, he's going to put that in the Gettysburg Address, and that's going to eventually become the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments, and he's going to grow in that process because he's going to move from just no one should be a slave to eventually, actually, blacks are citizens. And at the end of his life, he's going to say they should be equal voters. And at the end of my book, women are going to be equal voters too, because we are all born free and equal. And that equal is going to expand, not just equal liberty now, but equal citizenship and equal voting rights. That's the story of this 80-year period.
Amazing. And friends in the audience who are watching, Akhil's challenge to you or invitation to read the primary text is so important. He's inspired me and so many others about the central importance of primary text. And you can find the Cooper Union Address and so many others at the National Constitution Center's Founders Library. Akhil, tell us about the constitutional vision that Lincoln expressed in his major speeches as president. You talk about them in chapter 13, Washington City, Antietam, Gettysburg, and Atlanta. In the Gettysburg Address, he channels John Marshall and Daniel Webster with his famous invocation of government of, by, and for the people. Previously, he's criticized the Dred Scott decision on constitutional grounds. What is the mature vision of equality that Lincoln expresses in the Gettysburg Address?
And his criticism of Dred Scott reminds us that even though we have to pay attention to what courts do, and it's central to the rule of law, ultimately, in the long run, we, the people of the Supreme Court, we need to understand the Constitution. Constitutions can be amended. Dred Scott said a whole bunch of outlandish things. One thing that it said is that blacks could never be citizens. Lincoln, and it also said, Dred Scott said blacks were not meant to be included in all men are created equal. Douglas is riffing on Stephen Douglas, not Frederick, Stephen Douglas is riffing on Dred Scott. And Lincoln says, you made that up. The Declaration of Independence doesn't say anything like, all men except blacks are created equal. All whites are created equal. Lincoln says, it doesn't say, and that he says, find me someone before 1850 who ever said that. He's making, again, originalist arguments. So he's pushing back against the Supreme Court, saying the Supreme Court misread the Declaration. And the Supreme Court said, Congress can't prohibit slavery in the territories. And Lincoln's saying, what are you talking about? The Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery in the territories, and that actually was drafted in New York in 1787, just when the Philadelphia Convention was meeting. And it was based on, in part, an earlier version by none other than Thomas Jefferson. And when the Constitution goes into effect, one of the first 10 laws ever adopted, signed by George Washington, is a statutory version of the Northwest Ordinance. So of course you can prohibit slavery in certain territories. We did it from day one. And this is what the Cooper Union speech is all about. The early founders believed in prohibiting slavery in the territories. And then he says, and there's the Northwest, there's the Missouri Compromise. It prohibits slavery, north of a certain line. So in this chapter 13, Lincoln actually he's besieged. He's got Confederates who have illegally seceded, and he's got to deal with them. He's got a Supreme Court that's not quite on his side, in various ways, and he has to actually say, they're not right. So, well, you say, well, the South thinks one thing, and Lincoln thinks another thing, and the Supreme Court thinks another thing. So, who's to say? Here's my argument. The Constitution is to say, and that's why we Americans need to know the Constitution. So of all the primary sources, the most important is the Constitution. Oh, and you could read, audience members, you could experience the interactive Constitution, which is another great innovation of Jeff Rosen at the National Constitution Center. It's online. Every clause of the Constitution, you could read it, and there's commentary about it. What a liberal says about it, what a conservative says about it, what they both agree on. So Lincoln says the Constitution must decide. First, on secession. It's unconstitutional. It's the law of the land. If they were right to secede, they would have put it in there because that would have been a great sales, pitch. Hey, money back guarantee. If you don't like it, you can leave. It doesn't say anything like that. It says perfect union, law of the land. If you take arms against the federal government, it's treason. Wow, it's clear. That's the text. Not a single framer ever said otherwise in 1787, 88. A whole year when they're debating the thing, no one on the pro side ever said, hey, money back guarantee. They said instead, ratification must be in toto and forever. So the South is wrong on constitutional law. Oh, I insist on that in chapter 12, right before. So, and now what about slavery? Lincoln admits there was slavery. And states can have slavery, and he doesn't think the federal government can mess with slavery in the states ordinarily, but they can prohibit slavery in DC and in the West and the territories. But now, since there's a war going on, the federal government has new constitutional power. And he's getting this from John Quincy Adams. In order to win a war, you can free slaves constitutionally. Lord Dunmore did that in the Revolutionary War. The Brits did that in the War of 1812. Everyone knew that in a war, you can liberate if you contraband that the enemy has. You can use its corn. You can use its mules, its horses. Well, you can free its slaves too. Now, it would be wrong to take its slaves and enslave them yourself. That would be morally wrong. And Lincoln isn't doing that. He's saying, let's free the slaves. So they're not actually working for the Confederacy. They can work for themselves. Oh, and please join our army. We could use you. And when they join the army, which is Frederick Douglass's crusade, they win in blood what will ultimately become their citizenship and voting rights. They've earned it because they are the margin of victory in the Civil War. And Lincoln understands that. And that's chapter 13, how we go from, a world where there are millions of slaves still in America to, by the end, through the Emancipation Proclamation, a 13th Amendment that's going to end slavery everywhere immediately without any compensation. Wow, that could only happen because of war. And the guy who has the theory that in a war you can do that is John Quincy Adams, who's the link between the Declaration of Independence, his father, and Lincoln, his protege.
Amazing. Chapter 15, Pennsylvania Avenue, talks about the Reconstruction amendments. You talk about how each of the amendments builds on the other. First of all, tell me about the textual antecedents of equal protection of the law. Andrew Jackson had used it in his veto message of the bank. He said, every man is equally entitled to protection by the law. Is that the earliest source, or are there earlier analogs? And to what degree did the Reconstruction amendments, by enshrining the idea of equality in the Constitution, make concrete the vision of birthright equality for all times?
So, to a surprising extent to our audience, Lincoln builds on Andrew Jackson in certain ways. Andrew Jackson confronted a proto-secessionist crisis, the nullification crisis. South Carolina misbehaved, and General Jackson stood up to that, just as George Washington stood up to the Whiskey Rebellion. And those are the two major precursors, precedents, if you will, for Lincoln resisting secession. So in actually the cabinet room, he's got a painting of General Jackson, believe it or not, because Jackson, had steel in his spine, and he was going to protect the Union. He fought for the Union. He understands without Union, you can't beat the British, and he did beat the British at the Battle of New Orleans. So Lincoln builds on Jackson in certain ways. Lincoln's also a brilliant politician. He wants to actually sometimes steal some of the thunder from the other party. So he says all sorts of nice things about Jefferson, who was, in effect, the founder of the Democratic Party, and Jackson, in the same way that Ronald Reagan, said nice things about Franklin Roosevelt from time to time. And Clinton tried to appropriate, actually, Ronald Reagan. The era of big government is over. This is a very clever politician if you're actually sometimes trying to reach across the aisle and say, oh, I have something in common with General Jackson, with Thomas Jefferson. All honor to Jefferson. Lincoln believes that, but he's also, he's very wily. He's a very impressive politician as well as a great and good man. Jackson did use the language of equal protection in a famous veto message, but forget equal protection just for a moment. It's what courts talk about. I highlight even before that clause, the first sentence, all persons born in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States, okay? That means we're all born citizens. We're all born free and equal citizens from these northern state constitutions, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and elsewhere. We're all born equal. That's an idea, and it's a particular kind of equality idea. It's birth equality. We're born equal, black or white, male or female, Jew or Gentile, whether we're born in wedlock or out, whether your parents are citizens when you're born, I think yours were, whether your parents aren't citizens when you're born, that's me. They were here legally. My parents were med students, but they weren't citizens, but I'm still born equal to everyone else, whether you're born with dark skin or light skin, as I said, in wedlock or out. That's the book. Born equal. It's a birth equality idea, even before we get to the Equal Protection Clause, which is about persons more generally, not just citizens. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 says people are born equal, and what that means is that they have equal civil rights. Why was that statute passed? Because Dred Scott had said, oh, blacks can't be equal, even if they're free. They can't be citizens. They can't be equal. And the statute said, oh, yes, they can. And Jeff, in the interactive Constitution, which you put together, many scholars were assigned an individual clause. Now, truthfully, I would have been happy writing about anything, but I got to pick one clause, and I thought, oh, should I pick the preamble? You gave me an early choice. I said, no, I'm going to pick the first sentence of the 14th Amendment, which is an equality idea, that we're born citizens and therefore born free and equal citizens, because that's the sentence that makes me a birthright citizen. That was the gift the Constitution gave me on the day of my birth. So yes, there's equal protection, and it's Andrew Jackson, and he's trying to bring in former Democrats into his coalition, like Andrew Johnson, like Salmon P. Chase. They were former Democrats, you see, and he's trying to reach out to Jackson types, the Blairs, the Blair family, who were Jackson Democrats. But that first sentence of the 14th Amendment is also an equality idea. We're born citizens. We're born equal citizens.
That is so moving to tell your story of how that first sentence made you a birthright citizen, and how that relates to the primary aim of your book, which is to explain what the Constitution really means and to put the idea of birthright equality as your central contribution to a broader discourse about the meaning of history. It's time for us to sum up. Of course, you tell the extension of the idea of birth equality to women and the story of the 19th Amendment. So you can maybe give us a sense of that, and then explain why it is that for you the idea of birth equality is the central contribution of the book and of this period of American history.
So I've told you about Abe Lincoln, and he's one of my four main characters. I've just mentioned Frederick Douglass, who's born a slave and rises to meteoric heights. No one in America had ever been born so low and risen so high. He's more photographed than any American of the century, an amazing orator and writer, and eventually he becomes a government official, a statesman. But I haven't mentioned as much the two women. So I've got Abe and I've got Frederick, and I tell the story of their emerging their friendship. They only meet three times, but it's an amazing story of the three times they meet. Um, but I mentioned Elizabeth Cady. She becomes in the first paragraph, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She kind of, marries on an impulse and off she goes on her honeymoon. And then she's going to create the Seneca Falls Convention, which says we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And she calls for women's suffrage. And others are kind of nervous. And Frederick Douglass supports her in this on day one. And the book is going to end with the women's suffrage in 1920. I haven't spent as much time telling you about the fourth amazing person, Harriet Beecher Stowe. I call her America's first female superstar. Everyone in America is talking about her. She sells more books than anyone in the century, more than Mark Twain, more than Herman Melville. She's a big deal. Americans are focusing on a woman. And what is she talking about? Slavery and how we should end it. And she's talking about slavery for women as well as for, men. You have to think about them. It's not just field hands. It's women who are being raped and their kids are being ripped from them. And she herself had lost a baby, and she's writing as a woman rather than under pseudonym. Let's say the Bronte sisters, or George Sand or George Eliot. She's writing as a woman, as a mother. So she's an amazing person. The fusion of the women's movement and the Black rights anti-slavery movement. That's what chapter one was about. They kind of come together and the men kick the women out. And then the complicated history of these great reform movements that sometimes, are working in tandem together and sometimes are pulling apart in tension. But finally, with the 19th Amendment, the Women's Suffrage Amendment, at the end of the book, 1920, the equality idea actually kind of achieves a harmony. And now we've ended slavery everywhere. And we've promised equal civil rights to everyone. That's the 14th Amendment. And we've ended race discrimination in voting for Blacks. That's the 15th Amendment. And finally, by the end of the book, we get rid of sex discrimination in voting. And one real question, Jeff, is why did it take so long between Black rights and women's rights? I have a bunch of theories about why that's so. You could read the book. It's not one thing. It's about 8 different things. But I want readers to understand the greatness of America, how the amendments have made amends for the sins of earlier generations. The Constitution's gotten better over time. And I want Americans today to understand the previous generations of Americans that produced and picked these amazing leaders. But I want you also to get a sense of these leaders themselves, what leadership looked like. And volume 1 was 6 white men. But here we have Abe Lincoln, a white man, Frederick Douglass, a Black man, 2 white women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Harriet Beecher. So there are many other people in the book, Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul and Lucretia Mott, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Frances Ellen Watkins. I don't have one leading Black woman, quite Ida B. Wells, who's as prominent as these big 4. But that's because I'm not trying to just give you an inspiring person just to give you an inspiring person. I'm actually talking about the people who are driving the reforms. And they actually are women as well as men, and Blacks as well as whites. There's not quite as prominent a Black woman. There are going to be more prominent Black women in volume 3, Shirley Chisholm, Barbara Jordan, and others. So But this is, I hope, an inclusive story of America, and an inspiring story of America.
Thank you so much, Akhil Amar, for your inclusive and inspiring story of America and for inspiring Americans to learn more about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the words that made us and the principles that unite us. Friends, you can learn more by reading Akhil's superb new book, Born Equal, America's Constitutional Conversation, and by checking out the National Constitution Center's America 250 Civic Toolkit with Akhil's interactive declaration and the contribution of so many great historians to the big ideas of the Declaration and the Constitution. Akhil, congrats again on the book and can't wait to see you at the NCC on Constitution Day.
On Pub Day, September 16th. Come out and see us.
It's going to be great. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Thank you.